We're talking about how to use our talents and resources properly, and our conversation centers on the donation that the leaders of the tribes made towards the Mishkan, which seems to be a very cheap donation. Here they are, they're upset about the fact that they did not have an early involvement in the contributions towards the Mishkan, so now they want to compensate for it. They want to be the first in line when the Mishkan goes live. And what do they contribute? Between 12 of them, 6 wagons. Half a wagon per person. Doesn't seem like an over-the-top enthusiastic contribution. So we're trying to work out why. Like, why is it that this is the angle that they're coming from? The first thing we're going to notice, just in the language, which is really, really interesting, is if you had to think about wagons to transport the Mishkan, you'd expect the language to be that they donated, or they gifted, or they contributed wagons. That's what you'd expect. When you look in the Torah actually uses the expression vayakrivu hanesiim. Vayakrivu comes from the same word that we use when you bring a sacrifice, a korban, which is very strange. Here you're talking about the transportation of the Mishkan. You're not talking about something that is part of the structure of the Mishkan, and you definitely are not talking about something that is part of the service in the Mishkan. So how do you use this word, vayakrivu, that they offered, that they brought close? The same word that implies a sacrifice. Unless, of course, it's telling us that there's much more to the nature of their gift than what we assumed. So let's step out of our conversation for 1 second and step into the conversation of the korban for a moment and just understand, how does a korban work? So let's say a person wants to donate an animal, let's just say, for the particular offering that they want to bring. What are the rules that we know around that animal in order to qualify as a suitable animal to bring as a sacrifice? So what are the requirements?
No blemishes.
No blemishes, right? So that means to say it's got to be what the Torah calls tamim. Tamim means that it's got to be complete. Cannot have a blemish, cannot have anything wrong with it. Okay, that's the first thing. What else do we know about the animal? It has to be the right age. And the Torah mandates for different sacrifices what age it has to be. Now, what happens, let's say, if a person decides to bring korban X, let's say that a person is donating what we call an oila offering, which you could donate as, even though it's not necessarily an obligation, but you want to give something to the temple, so you can bring an oila offering. And the mandate of the Torah is that this oila offering is one particular kind of animal. Let's just say it's a sheep. Can you decide that you're going to bring 2 sheep as that offering? The answer is no. You can make 2 different pledges of 2 different oila offerings, but the Torah mandates not only that the animal shouldn't be lacking anything, but the animal is also not allowed to be more than what you're supposed to pledge. So you can't double up the sacrifice. Each one would have to be its own unique pledge. And by the way, for that matter, even if the animal, let's just say, it's a bit more of a strange example, but let's just say that it had some extra organ, it also wouldn't be kosher, because in the same way as the animal may not lack anything in order to be brought as an offering, it can't have any additional. Now, we saw a similar thing when it was time to contribute to the Mishkan, and that's actually why the leaders of the tribes got left out in the cold, because the Torah says, V'hamelocha ha'isa dayom, all of the things that they brought in order to contribute to build the Mishkan was dayom, it was sufficient, like the word dayenu, was enough. And they started to have more than what they needed, so they immediately sent an announcement throughout the whole camp, don't bring anything more. Because just as important as it is not to have too little, it is equally important not to have too much. And the reason for that is, yes, on the one hand, as we discussed, ein anius b'makom ashirus, if you're in a place of opulence, you're in a place of dignity for Hashem, you don't want to be cheap. At the same time, you don't want to just have excess. Excess is also not a healthy thing. In fact, there's not in this context, but in a different context, there's a Hasidic word that says that if a person is wearing pants that are too long, the chances are you'll trip. So excess actually gets in the way of what you're trying to achieve. You think it's a good thing, but it's more of the same. What's right? If you like what I'm doing, I'll do more. It's actually unhealthy. So if the wagons that they're bringing fall into this category of a korban, because you see that the Torah uses that expression, vayakrivu, then that implies that in the same way as they should not bring less than necessary, they also should not bring more than necessary. And that must have driven their decision to bring only 6 wagons, not 1 wagon per leader, which would have been more logical for us, because somehow there would have been too many wagons that, of course, we now have to decode. How? How could it be too many wagons?
Didn't come by way of an instruction.
Okay, good. So now the question is, was this instructed by Hashem? And the answer is no. There's no direct instruction from Hashem how many wagons to bring. What we are told is that afterwards, Hashem, through Moshe, endorsed their choice. But they made the choice first. Now, of course, that's a great thing, and it means that they were obviously aligned with what needed to happen. It doesn't explain to us why that was the way it should be. It just tells us it had the divine stamp of approval. So the question is, why? In order to get to that question, let's try and work out how on earth could the wagons be considered like an offering, like a sacrifice? How? It's not even something that's built into the Mishkan structure itself. And it is certainly not something which is brought as part of the service in the Mishkan. So how do the wagons land up being considered like an offering? So to get to that, do you remember the alternate name for the Mishkan? So in the Torah, we use the word Mishkan, not that often. We have another word that we use much more often when we refer the what? No, Beis Hamikdash is later in history. It's only when they get to Jerusalem. And then they build a different structure. They call that the Beis Hamikdash. But this is still the Mishkan in the desert. It has another name. So remember what the other name is? Yes. The?
Place of meeting.
Place of meeting, right? But the truth of the matter is it's not called the place of meeting. It's called the tent of meeting. Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. Now, let's compare that for a moment to the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash is called Beis Hamikdash. It's called a Beis, a house. What's the difference between a house and a tent? I mean, there are many differences, obviously. What's the most obvious or the greatest difference between a house and a tent?
The house is fixed. The
Permanent.
tent
Exactly. The Beis Hamikdash, by design, from day dot, had to be a permanent structure that not only is immovable, but even after the building is destroyed, the place is still a holy place. That's how permanent the Beis Hamikdash is. By contrast, the Mishkan cannot be permanent. By definition, it cannot be permanent because the Jews will be traveling through the desert, and the purpose of this Mishkan is that it has to accompany them wherever they go, which means, in the same way as the definition of the Beis Hamikdash is permanent, and if it's not permanent, it's not a Beis Hamikdash. In the same way, the definition of the Mishkan is portable, and if it's not portable, it's not a Mishkan. So how is the Mishkan going to be portable? Yes, it's the structure is a DIY structure. You know, you can put it together and take it apart relatively easily. That's not portable yet. That's just temporary. How do I ensure that the Mishkan is portable? I have to have a transport system. Which means that at this point, they've put all of the pieces in place in order to build this Mishkan. The boards, the covers, the columns, the curtains, the sockets, the clasps, everything's in place. And you could build the whole thing. And it's not yet considered a Mishkan. Because if I don't have a way to move it, it's not portable. If it's not portable, it's not a Mishkan. So now that gives us a whole different perspective on the wagons. The wagons are not just utility, because I need a way to move the Mishkan. Okay, so what should we do? Let's get wagons. The wagons turn the Mishkan into a Mishkan. In other words, we're at the point now they're about to inaugurate the Mishkan. And we know that the way they're going to inaugurate it is they're going to bring sacrifices, one per tribe, over 12 days in order to inaugurate the Mishkan, which is true. What we don't think about is even before they can inaugurate the Mishkan, they have to put that critical last piece of the puzzle in place, which is turn it into a Mishkan. How do you do that? You make wagons. Now it's portable. If it's portable, it's now considered a Mishkan. If it's now considered a Mishkan, you could start using it. Turns out that the Nasiim, the leaders of the tribes, are actually playing an extremely pivotal role in the construction of the Mishkan. That explains why they felt very left out before, because they didn't contribute to the materials, and now they have found, through their innovation and their enthusiasm, they found a way not only to play a role, but to, in a sense, play a role that's even more important than the people who brought the gold and the wool and the wood, because none of that can work until our wagons are in place. So their contribution of the wagons is a very big deal, and if it's so integral and so central to making the Mishkan, we can understand why it's comparable to an offering. In fact, it's even bigger than an offering. It's the cause of all the offerings. It licenses the process of the Mishkan. But it will have the same concept as an offering, which is don't give too little and don't give too much. So that would explain why they're keeping this minimalistic. It doesn't yet give us the fullest picture of what, why they came to this particular conclusion. So there's something else to take into consideration, and that is based on the beginning of the parasha and the end of last parasha. The end of last parasha introduced to us that there are 3 families of the tribe of Levi. And then it began to introduce to us at the end of last week's parasha, and it concluded at the beginning of this week's parasha, that each family of Levi had a very unique role to play in the Mishkan, not in the rituals of the Mishkan, in the Mishkan itself. What was their role that they had to play, these 3 families, as described in the parasha? They were responsible to transport the Mishkan. It was their job. So different components of the Mishkan belonged to the different families. And that's what the Torah describes to us. Now, if you think about it, before we know anything about the leaders of the tribes and their wagons, meaning at the beginning of the 6th parasha, and the end of last week's parasha, when the instruction was given to the various families of Levi that they have to transport the Mishkan, how did we read or understand that instruction to them originally? At face value. Hashem comes to the family of Gershon and says, you're going to carry this, and the family of Kahas, and you're going to carry that. So, at face value, what's the instruction? Carry. Sounds like wherever they travel through the desert, the tribe of Levi is going to have the responsibility of schlepping, right? Nobody said anything about the fact that they're going to be wagons. So when we first encountered the instruction to the family of Levi to transport the Mishkan, at face value, the instruction was, you transport the Mishkan, whatever that's going to take. Now the question is, can you, and this is where it becomes so relevant to our generation, can you use a technology to assist you in the instruction, the job that you were given? In other words, you were told to move the components of the Mishkan. Does that mean you're allowed or you're not allowed to use the great advancement of the day, which is the wheel? Are you allowed to use a wagon or not? Now, this is not a straightforward question, because we know, fast forward, and somebody mentioned this actually when we started this conversation, fast forward all the way to King David. When they were moving the ark, King David chose to put the ark onto a wagon, and it was disastrous. It was the wrong decision. And as a result, the wagon hit a bit of a bump in the road, and everything looked like the ark was going to fall. And there was a man called Uzzah who jumped out to try and catch it. And he was killed for that, because the Torah says that the ark carried those who carried it. So therefore, it should not need anything else to carry it. In other words, it's not so simple that you could just bring in a technology and say, we're going to put this onto a wagon. So if that's the case with the ark, is that the case of the Mishkan? Is it maybe that Hashem said carry it, and it means carry it? So the answer is, the Mishkan does not have the same restriction as the ark, that it had to be carried on your shoulder, on the one hand.
There were poles
On the other hand, the ark had poles, but so did the table. The Shulchan table also had poles, and the gold Mizbeach altar also had poles. So these things were designed in order to be carryable. Nevertheless, it's only the ark that the Torah says, and the Rambam records it as one of the 613 mitzvahs, that it has to be carried by hand or carried on your shoulder. The Mishkan does not have that restriction, which means you're allowed to bring a technology on board to make the Levium's job a little bit easier. But you cannot bring a technology on board that replaces the Nevi'im completely. And that's a very important distinction to make. The distinction between being able to use technology to enhance or support what you're supposed to be doing versus to step back from what you're doing because now there's technology that can do it on my behalf. So like, for example, you hear people in today's world asking questions like, could you listen to a recording of the Megillah on Purim? Or could you get something to animate the text for davening on a big screen at the front of the shul, and we don't have to have a siddur that we turn pages, etc. So these are common questions, and people would say there can't obviously be wisdom or instruction in the Torah about these things because the technology didn't exist. Well, that's not accurate. Because our technology didn't exist doesn't mean they never had a question about whether the technology of the time had a role to play in their service. Here's a brilliant example. So they've got this technology. It's not hugely advanced technology, but the idea of being able to transport something on a wagon is technically a technology versus a personal responsibility to transport the Mishkan. So what do the leaders of the tribe do? They say, we're going to create a system that will force a hybrid between the technology and the practitioners, between the Levium and the wagons. So we'll provide wagons, but we'll keep those wagons to a minimum so that the Levium will have to be vigilant on either side or behind or wherever they have to stand as the wagons travel through the desert, because those boards will slip. That's the design. It's going to be piled too high because there are not enough wagons. And so every time they start to slip a little bit, the Levi is going to be on his game and he's going to have to come and adjust. So he's technically, physically involved in the transportation of the Mishkan, even though he's not physically carrying the Mishkan. It has such a great lesson for us, especially in today's world where everybody is so fixated on AI and what it's going to do, and the machines are going to replace us and that kind of thing. The Torah's attitude would be, the minute you reach a point, at least in your Judaism, where you believe that a machine is going to replace what you're doing, you've missed the point. A machine should only make what you're doing more efficient. It could never replace. You can't have the wagon instead of the Levi. That's not kosher. You can't have the robot instead of the human putting on tefillin or reading from the Torah or whatever the case is. That's not how it works. It can aid us, right? So we could, for example, if you wanted to have a robot that rolls the Torah to the right place, great. So it makes things more efficient. Or if you wanted to have a pre-timed announcement thing that tells you what page, Jeff wouldn't appreciate this, that tells you what page we're on in the okay, you can have those things, but you can't have it replace your actual mitzvah. And that's exactly what's going on over here in the desert. They want to ensure that the Levium still have the opportunity and therefore the privilege of being able to serve in Hashem's service. So they've got to be on guard as they're traveling through, watching those boards at any time, jumping in, keeping them straight, etc., etc. There's another angle to this as well, and that is, okay, so now we get the relationship between the wagons and the Levium, but we haven't yet addressed the question of why did they keep it to only 2 oxen per wagon? Because the load on these wagons was going to be pretty heavy. And it's quite normal when you think about an ox wagon, it's quite normal to have a span of 4 or 6, maybe even more oxen pulling a wagon. It's completely doable, it's completely normal, and yet here they kept it down to only 2 oxen per wagon, which means what? Think of it for a moment from the perspective of the oxen. Let's hope they didn't belong to a union or something, right? So think of it from the perspective of the oxen. What's happening if there's only 2 oxen pulling this heavy wagon? They've got to work, which effectively means they have to be at maximum operating level. If there were 4 oxen, they might have been operating at 80% each, right?
That's why they didn't have a union.
That's why they didn't have a union, right? So what's the message there? The message is that we have a saying from our sages, Loi bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu davar echad ba'olamai levatala. Right? Hashem never created in His world even one thing without a purpose. There's even an interesting, I don't know if it's a Gemara or Medrash, I don't remember offhand, with King David, that King David was once a little bit skeptical about the value of a spider. Like, why do we have to have spiders? You might, in the middle of summer, have a similar skepticism about a mosquito. So he's like, what's the value of a spider? And when King Saul was on the manhunt for King David, because he believed that King David wanted to overthrow him, and King David had to escape, on one occasion he hid in a cave, and a spider spun a web over the entrance of the cave. So when King Saul's soldiers came past, they figured, oh, there's nobody in this cave because the web is still intact, and it saved his life. And then King David had to humbly acknowledge that every single thing in this world has a purpose. But when we say that every single thing in the world has a purpose, it doesn't only mean that it has a purpose, it means that we have to use that purpose to the fullest. So if I have 2 oxen that can pull that weight, and instead I choose to use 4 oxen, then I'm not allowing things to serve their purpose to the fullest.
You're dissolving their merit.
Exactly. And that's the second lesson that the Torah wants us to learn over here. So the first lesson is, don't replace humans with technology when you have an opportunity to connect to Hashem. The other lesson is, know your strength and use it to the fullest. So if an ox has to use its brute force to the fullest in order to achieve what the Mishkan has to do, we all have to spend some time in the mirror and say, well, what are my strengths? What are my talents? And how do I use them to the fullest? How do I ensure that I'm not just one of these people I'm fortunate because I happen to be good at X, and therefore I just do it without much effort? Well, am I then achieving X to the ultimate of what I could? And that's probably the most important lesson out of all of this, is if we're in Hashem's Mishkan, which means essentially if we're in Hashem's service, probably one of the most important things is to know who we are, what we bring to the table, and ensure that we're using that in the very best, most efficient, most effective way. Because if not, it's almost an element of sacrilegious behavior.
Thank you, Rabbi.